means nothing but just a number when actions do not align with our words. What the future holds for some is unbearable. Hence, scientists and others discuss that it might become necessary for humanity to try something radical like solar radiation modification as a painkiller for rapid climate change. Studies are being done on such interventions. They focus on reflecting sunlight back into space, resulting in cooling through techniques such as seeding clouds with sea salt particles or spraying aerosols in the stratosphere. But as good as it sounds to be true, these technologies may also produce unintended consequences that ripple all over the globe and could lead to a butterfly effect of disastrous events. For centuries, we have demonstrated control over spaces and natural resources by establishing borders. But can we divide our atmosphere? How do we plan to govern discussions that can affect the global climate? Today, we will explore how one of the most arguable discussions of one of the most impactful technologies of the 21st century is taking place among people from different regions of the world.
Solar radiation modification is not a comprehensive solution to the climate crisis, but if deployed appropriately, it can provide us with some additional time to implement effective measures for mitigating the disastrous effects. Also, governance is a broad term. We even need governance to assess whether a technology should or should not be utilized. Additionally, the governance of research is very crucial in this field. Without proper governance, there is a risk we might start focusing more on SRM and less on mitigation options that actually address the root causes of the problem.
I agree that it might be helpful in situations where climate-vulnerable countries would be struggling to adapt to climate change. But I am skeptical about who would be in control of this decision and how we make sure that it would not be by groups of powerful countries or private companies. They could also treat SRM as a new facet of neocolonialism towards developing countries without any accountability regarding its potential negative consequences.
Also, research has endless potential. How can we confirm that something tested on a small scale will yield the same outcomes on the larger scale? I affirm that solar geoengineering at a planetary scale is not governable in a globally inclusive and just manner within the current international political system. What is more, these technologies do not tackle any of the real root causes of climate change. Instead of investing in this research, we should focus on developing green energy and allocating resources towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
But aren't you being overly optimistic? IPCC reports have already mentioned that we are not on track to meet our temperature goals. The trajectory shows a high likelihood that we will overshoot the 1.5 to 2 degrees temperature goals. Therefore, what alternative options are you proposing when the world finds itself in an overshoot scenario if you suggest refraining from the progress of SRM research? I absolutely believe that we should explore new possibilities and have informed knowledge ready in hand. This could be one more tool in the toolbox of climate solutions.
Indeed, SRM can help some countries combat warming, but it also has the potential to negatively impact neighboring nations, such as increased rainfall or drought. Do you not think such situations could escalate existing geopolitical tensions between countries?
And what if countries keep suddenly changing decisions about using or not using SRM? Is there such a thing as a global thermostat control? Such actions will result in much worse disastrous effect than where we were before deploying SRM.
Inclusive, transparent,
accountable frameworks.
Inclusive, transparent. frameworks.
Inclusive, transparent,
Accountable frameworks.
Youth voices should be heard, as the decisions made today will directly impact our future.
Right. So that was a video that we have made working past 2 months through a program that we have been engaged with, which was Youth Voices for Emerging in Climate Governance, which was initiated by Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. So now we would like to give a brief introduction of us. So we are three, Clara, Sarah, and Asima. I'm Asima Kamal, and we are the co-founders of SRM Youth Watch, which is an initiative where we would be focusing on raising capacity building and raising awareness among youth, and focusing mainly on Global South. So just to say a short introduction of me, I'm Asima Kamal. I'm from Bangladesh. It's in South Asia. And SRM, since being involved in the program since past year, I have not heard about SRM. So SRM is a new concept, is a very, very new concept. I have passed my undergraduation last year in environmental science and management, but I haven't been able to hear SRM. So, but that doesn't mean, while I've been engaging so far, that doesn't mean that we are less responsible for being aware of what is happening around it, and that being a person from a climate vulnerable country and being a youth, it is in dire need that we need to be aware what is happening around it. So with that said, I would like to give my mic to my colleague Sarah, just to allow her to give a brief introduction of her. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We're glad to have all of you here. My name is Kurit Sarah Chebjira. I'm a climate justice activist from Uganda, and I've been part of the C2G Youth Voice Project, and we've been learning about solar radiation modification, and a little bit about what I did before joining the project. I was campaigning, just basically raising awareness about about climate change among young people in Uganda. I am a team lead for Climate Change Action Africa. We do raise awareness in schools, and we've started climate action clubs in 15 schools. And before I started the project, I'd not heard about solar radiation modification. And so I first read about it while I was applying. So I was like, this is something that we young people really need to know, especially I felt that there was a very huge need for me to know, because I was raising awareness about climate change, and that young people in Africa needed to know about this new emerging technology. So I applied and go through, and I've been able to really learn a lot. And I've really had serious concerns about, the potential impact. And also, most importantly, I really see the need for young people to really know about this technology. Yeah, that's a bit about what I do. Thank you.
I think I'll just stay here, because then people can, I'll just stay here. It's easier. Hi, everyone. I'm Clara. I'm from Brazil, but I've been based in Europe for the past years. And unlike Sarah and Asima, SRM and geoengineering was something that I was already thinking about for a couple of years. I first heard of it in an international symposium on climate geoengineering, which was in Brazil. And as like a young person in the room, the only young person I could see in the room, but that's common that we go to places as young activists and we're kind of like alone in the room, but that was fine. The thing is, being part of the environmental and climate bubble for so many years, hearing about something that I had never heard of before really shocked me. And the fact that it was a very restricted environment where young people weren't given a space or a voice to talk about those technologies, which are literally something that we will be deciding on in the coming years, and that young people are already doing research on it and all that. But I'd say that 5 years ago, that's still talking about SRM was still on the margins, and no one really wanted to talk about it, and no one felt we should as well, because we have so many other priorities. But I think that the narrative has changed a lot in the past year, with the EU talking about it, the US, UNEP. So we do have a momentum, and I think that for us as young people, we might as well just take the opportunity as well and build this capacity and be informed about it, and make this knowledge spread through all of the different climate and environmental groups that we have. Because if not us, then who? So I think we have this urgency of openly talking about it and discussing. I think there's been this misconception that when you talk about SRM, you always need to be in one of the sides and being polarized. But I think we have this unique opportunity of as young people of just bringing this discussion forward in a non-polarized way. And I'd say that it's a great honor for us that now to launch SRM Youth Watch internationally, we'll have opening remarks by Thelma Krug, which is a Brazilian scientist whom I admire a lot. I don't know if she'll be up on screen. Yeah, she's probably in there already. But she was the former vice chair of the IPCC and has been representing Brazil. There she is. Has been representing Brazil in the UNFCCC negotiations for I'd say over 15 years. Correct me if I'm wrong, Thelma. And Thelma has been supporting a lot of our work, and I think it's really good as well that we as young people don't focus also on our generations, that we can promote intergenerational dialogues and not remain in silos. And the panel that we have coming up after Thelma is on young women on SRM. So might as well start with the older generation and have Thelma passing the torch on to them. So yeah, the floor is yours, Thelma.
Yes, thank you very much for this introduction. As a matter of fact, I was in IPCC for 21 years, so long enough. And I see that there is a lot of light. Can you see me okay, or should I close the window here?
No, we can see you perfectly.
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you. So good morning to all the participants. It's really a pleasure for me to be here this morning in the launch of the SRM Youth Watch and the platform. And sorry for not having been able to be there in person, but I'm very thankful for the opportunity to make these opening remarks directly from Brazil. And happy to see a representative from Brazil also in this beautiful table, and a friend from Uganda and others. It's really impressive to see the youth, and in particular women, how they are engaged into this. So I would like to start my presentation highlighting the importance to understand solar radiation modification. You know, I'm going to refer to it as SRM. And some people call it solar radiation management. Others call it part of these climate altering technologies. It was used to be referred to as part of geoengineering, but this has been modified through time. We hardly talk about SRM under geoengineering. We talk more as SRM modification or management of the solar radiation. It's increasingly getting more and more attention, and we see that this is becoming really a hard topic, especially in the very, very recent years. And as has been said in the video, that was very good video, in the last assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you know, the IPCC, you know, the three reports from the three working groups provides detailed information on the scientific findings in hundreds of publications all around the world, mainly from the developed world, mainly from the global north. And IPCC concludes that the literature only support SRM as a supplement to deep mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, but recognizes the potential of SRM to offset warming and reduce some of the global risks of climate change related to temperature rise, sea ice loss, frequency of extreme storms and heat waves in some regions. However, the report also highlights the large uncertainties and knowledge gaps in relation to technology maturity, physical understanding, potential impacts and challenges of governance, all of which may constrain the ability to implement SRM even in the near future. So as we know, SRM consists of a portfolio of options. One of them, which is the stratospheric aerosol injection that we refer to as SAI, is the most studied one through modeling exercises that show potential benefits, but also risks, including the change in precipitation patterns in some regions of the world that could compromise their agriculture and implicitly their economies. One of the concerns with SAI, if deployed, is the need to ensure its continuity for many years. You know, the literature says 100 years. So as to avoid the so-called termination effect that could imply in a rapid rise in the global mean temperature. So to have the opposite effect. It is also known that the more intense the SRM deployment, the larger is the likelihood for the risks of side effects and environmental risks, depending obviously on the SRM option deployed. As I said, it's a portfolio of different options. And this makes the governance of SRM an issue of urgency. Currently, the literature says that we don't have a dedicated formal international SRM governance for research, development, demonstration, or deployment that, among other things, should ensure that SRM is considered only as part of a broader mitigation-centered portfolio of responses to climate change. I like to say that SRM is not a mitigation option. It is just a technology to minimize the risks, but it does nothing to reduce the greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, and the concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So as has been said in the video very briefly, and also from the panel, some multilateral agreements addressing SRM took place some years ago, such as the UN Convention on Biological Diversity or the Vienna Convention on the Protection of the Ozone Layer. But these only partially addressed SRM, in that the Biological Diversity Convention mainly concerned about impact on biodiversity. The lack of a robust and formal SRM governance poses risks, and numerous authors in the IPCC suggest a wide range of governance principles, including to guard against potential risks and harms, to enable appropriate research and development of scientific knowledge, and to legitimize any future research or policy making through active and informed public and expert community engagement. So this last principle is obviously of particular importance to this event, as we see some initiatives that are already taking shape, including through the publication of an SRM research plan and governance framework in the United States, or the European Union efforts to assess the risks and uncertainties of SRM and promote discussion on a potential international framework for its governance. The UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Programme, has also expressed the need for robust scientific assessment, development of governance frameworks, and promotion of globally inclusive discussions. But while these initiatives are taking place, others, like experiments in Australia on marine cloud brightening, which is another option under the portfolio of SRM, are advancing, and others being cancelled after objections from environmental groups and indigenous peoples or indigenous people. This highlights the need for inclusive research on SRM, particularly regarding the risks to ecosystems, to health, to agriculture, to the ozone layer, some of which are presently poorly understood. It may be necessary at some point to balance these risks against those without SRM. And the more we know, the better. But despite the growing research initiatives on SRM, supported by both public and private investments or funding, few researchers from the global south have been participating, being an issue of concern if informed decisions are to be taken, including on SRM governance. So it is in this context that the initiative to launch the SRM Youth Watch is very welcomed. The youth voice is becoming increasingly strong and needed, as the youth generation today may be the most affected by how this generation responds to the challenge and threat of climate change. So the launching of the SRM Youth Watch platform is an important initiative, as it creates a forum for discussions on SRM technology, how research is evolving, and how the results can be freely shared and conveyed to the youth all over the world. And this is the first step to claim for the inclusive participation of youth in the SRM governance at all levels, local, national, and international. Obviously, the platform will amplify opportunities for participation, including of youth among indigenous people and local communities, and will create an informed group of people that through their voices can stimulate changes and be increasingly more engaged on issues that might affect them directly, including the world continue to move towards an emission pathway that is not compatible with one that meets the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. If a pathway with no or limited overshoot is pursued, we might not need the SRM at all. But some studies mention that if emission reductions and carbon dioxide removal are deemed insufficient, SRM may be seen as the only option left to ensure the long-term temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. So I'm very happy to see many young women not only involved in the initiative, but creating the initiative. As several studies show that women have a strong voice on environmental and social issues. So I'm sure it is not going to be different here. So I wish all the best to you all and look forward for a very constructive discussion this morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you.
Onto what we're doing and what our goal is, what we plan to do. It's a big inspiration. Thank you very much for joining us, and we would move forward with our first panel from here. So as Talma Krug has mentioned about briefly about solar radiation modification, stratospheric aerosol injection, and marine cloud brightening, now in our first panel with Women in SRM, we are going to dig a little bit deeper with the science behind these technologies with women who are actually researching about the technologies out there. And yes, if you have any questions in Zoom, please leave it in the chat box, and we will have them answered after our panel discussion. The first woman or the first panelist of our first panel is Elise. Elise is a PhD student at the University of Exeter, UK, working on aerosol radiation interactions, including stratospheric aerosol injection. She is researching both the large-scale climate impacts and changes to extreme temperature and precipitation under multiple injection strategies. We will get to hear more of the science behind stratospheric aerosol injection from Elise. And it is, as Thelma Cook mentioned, one of the widely discussed technologies among the several technologies of solar radiation modification. Over to you, Elise.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. Great. So yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. It's a real privilege to be able to talk to you guys and be part of the launch of SRM Youth Watch. So yeah, so what I've asked to speak about a little bit was a bit about my background, but about my research as well, which was mentioned was more specifically stratospheric aerosol injection. So my background, just to tell you a little about me, I came to the University of Exeter almost 8 years ago to the day in 2015 to start my undergrad master's in maths. And when I came to Exeter, I had one thing for certain, which was I didn't want to do climate science. I wanted to stick to the pure maths. And I think by the end of my second year, or at least halfway through my third, I was like, no, climate science is for me. Pure maths is not my jam. And in my fourth year, I got to do like my master's project, and I worked on looking at sort of a missing source and the role of marine organics in cloud droplet formation over the Southern Ocean. So I was looking very much at clouds and atmospheric science and how aerosols interact with clouds in the environment, especially in sort of marine locations. And that really kind of got me hooked into the research that I'm doing now. And when I finished up that project in 2019, I kind of realized I wasn't quite done with research, and I applied for a PhD also at the University of Exeter in environmental intelligence. And that really gave me the opportunity to kind of formulate a research proposal of my own and sort of move that forward. So that's what I'm doing now, and will hopefully be finished with by the end of this year, beginning of next. And so it really was that master's project that kind of got me into solar radiation modification. So in my third year, actually, we had a few mini projects to get us prepared to write our master's thesis. And one of those was looking at what we really called then was just geoengineering. And actually, I didn't pursue that mini project. I was looking at air quality and solar radiation changes, but a few of my friends who were on the course, who also happened to be my housemates, were participating in this mini project about geoengineering. And so I would come home at the end of the day and we'd chat over dinner about our work and their research. And I was like, oh, that sounds really quite interesting. That whole research project was basically to look into all of these different types of techniques. And so that kind of got me hooked initially. And then in my final year project with the cloud project that I mentioned, I was fortunate enough to be working within a group who were all kind of doing similar projects, mostly atmospheric science and aerosol related, but with my current PhD supervisor, Professor Jim Hayward in Exeter. And I think just sort of being in that kind of environment and hearing about what some of my colleagues and peers were doing in terms of volcanic eruptions and some more sort of geoengineering methods really piqued my curiosity. And so that kind of led me to formulate my research proposal around solar radiation modification, but more specifically stratospheric aerosol injection. So to kind of give you more of a background on that, the first part of my PhD was looking at natural analogues for SAI. And we can really sort of think about that in terms of explosive volcanic eruptions. So back in 1991, there was this big volcanic eruption in Mount Pinatubo, and it injected a whole load of gases and ash into the atmosphere. And actually, it was so explosive that those gases and ash were injected into the stratosphere. So that's like the sort of outer part of the atmosphere. And it kind of ranges between sort of 10 to 20 kilometers above the surface, depending on where you are in the planet. So pretty high up. And one of the main components of that eruption was sulfur dioxide, or SO2. And when SO2 oxidizes in the atmosphere, it becomes this really reflective aerosol. So it's particles suspended in the atmosphere. And so it was reflecting all of the sunlight back to space. And what we saw after that eruption was about a period of 1 or 2 years of global cooling by about 0.5 degree. So it was just one injection of SO2 from this volcano, and it caused the whole planet to have a global average reduction of about 0.5 degree. But it only lasted for about a year or so, because the aerosols that get injected into the atmosphere fall out after a few months to a year. So this kind of then propelled the idea of stratospheric aerosol injection to intervene into the climate system to reduce the rising temperatures. So unlike a volcanic eruption, rather than having this one single injection of SO2, we would have a continuous injection into the stratosphere over a period of years, depending on what your scenario is and how long it takes to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And this is just an example of a strategy that you might use. And then the aerosol cloud that forms from that sulfur dioxide that I mentioned, this is just like an example of how that might be distributed across the stratosphere. But that would reflect sunlight back to space and then cool the surface of the planet. And that's what that final plot is showing there. So obviously, we kind of know that it works from volcanic eruptions. And there are lots of potential benefits of stratospheric aerosol injection. It can reduce heat waves and floods and droughts. It can reduce sea ice melting. And on the right-hand side here is just an example of some extreme heat. So this plot on the left is like a greenhouse gas, high emissions scenario. On the right-hand side, it's that same scenario, but with stratospheric aerosol injection on top of it. And it's just the number of days in a year that you'd experience really extreme heat overnight. And you can see that we just don't have as many of those nights with SAI. But that's obviously not the full story. As you've already heard, there are quite a lot of uncertainties associated with stratospheric aerosol injection. So you have the physical uncertainties of different patterns of surface cooling, precipitation patterns can shift. We might see ozone depletion in the stratosphere because we're sort of adding things into the stratosphere. It could be warming in the stratosphere, which could change large-scale circulation. But there are also modelling uncertainties. So the baseline scenario we choose to model from, so that greenhouse gas emissions scenario, that makes a difference. Our target temperature, like what temperature do we want the world to be, and how that might change in terms of how much you have to inject. So there are lots of modelling uncertainties. The one that I'm specifically interested in at the moment is the injection strategy, so where we're actually putting the aerosol. And this is quite a nice way of showing that. So this plot on the left here is looking at a stratospheric aerosol injection strategy where you're injecting between 10 degrees north and south. And when this kind of idea first surfaced, there's a circulation in the stratosphere that moves air from the equator to the poles. So the idea was you inject in one location and the circulation will spread the aerosol for you. But what we actually find, especially in the UK model, is it kind of gets stuck in the tropics. And so what you might want to do is inject away from the equator, which is a similar example to the one on the right here, where you injected at 4 different locations. And you can see that aerosol cloud is a bit more evenly distributed across the different latitudes. And this is just a nice example of showing you what those differences can do. So this is the surface air temperature relative to its target. So blue is it's cooler than the target temperature and red is warmer than the target temperature. And you can see when we're injecting at the equator, we have an overcooling and there's actually an undercooling or a residual warming at the poles. And it's actually not the surface temperature difference that causes problems. It's that contrast between an overcooled equator and an undercooled pole that can cause circulation and precipitation changes. And whilst on the right-hand side, the off-equatorial injection strategy isn't completely, white would be ideal. There'd be no change in terms of the target. But you can see it's much less unevenly distributed. And similarly to temperature, precipitation shifts are quite different depending on where you inject the aerosol. These have the same temperature target, so they should ideally be the same. But actually, you can see that you have much more of a drying over the Amazon and Central Africa than you do if you weren't to be injecting at the equator. And then I finally just want to kind of end with saying that even in the last sort of 5 or 6 years since I've been looking into this research area, so much has changed. As Thelma mentioned, we've sort of shifted from talking about geoengineering to potentially climate intervention. And I think it sort of it speaks a lot more to the fact that we don't know everything and that we would be interfering and changing things. But also the research has really developed a huge amount. A nice example of that actually on the right-hand side are these 2 photos from this modelling into comparison project that was set up back in 2010, I believe. And that top photo is the first meeting they had in 2011 with about 26 people. And that bottom photo was from Exeter in the summer that when we hosted it with over 90 people. But also I think what's really exciting, especially for me and for this group here, is that over 40 of those 90 people were early career researchers. So it's really great to be able to have a younger community coming through and really pushing that research forward. So yeah, it's very exciting to be here, and thank you very much for listening.
As you say that there has been a significant increase in people being involved in SRM research. I don't know if I should be scared or not about it, but it's one way it's good that we are having more people on board and early career researchers. We are having informed knowledge in hand, but increasing research, if it means that we are not progressing in the way where we should be, but definitely we need informed knowledge ready in hand, and research should be done and with proper governance, definitely. So thank you, Alice. We would now move on to Varisha. Varisha is a master's student of health informatics, working as a research associate under a project at Comstats University, Islamabad, Pakistan. Varisha is one of the members of the team as an early career scientist conducting her research in the area of climate change intervention through solar radiation modification. Her goal is to scrutinize the trade-off based impacts of SRM on malaria distribution across South Asia, particularly Pakistan, to observe the impacts of climate change intervention on malaria dynamics across the countries in the next few decades. Computational simulated climate data is being analyzed for South Asia with a special focus on Pakistan. And she is part of the research being carried out under a funded project of the Degrees Initiative. So I look forward to learning more about Varisha. We look forward to learning more about Varisha's research, and she would be focusing on health impacts and health impacts of research for SRM. Over to you, Varisha.
Hi, everyone. I'm Varisha Khan from Pakistan. I hope you're all good. And my introduction has been revealed already. So I'm a research associate at the Comstats University, Islamabad, and a student of health informatics. So before moving further, I would like to thank Clara and the whole team of SRM Youth for SRM Youth Watch for giving me this prestigious invitation to speak on the youth perspective and the governance of SRM. So I'll be later in my talk, I'll be talking about particularly behavior of seasonal diseases in response to SRM with a special focus on malaria. So the background story is very short. Like, I have done my bachelor's in biotechnology, and currently I'm doing my research. I'm doing my MS in health informatics, and the current research that I have been conducting is on solar radiation modification with respect to stratospheric aerosol injection. So how did I join the conversation of SRM? So it was actually with a background of health. I applied for this project that was announced by Professor Dr. Athar during one of our classes of geographical information system. So fortunately, I got selected for it, and then I started working on SRM. So with the concern of health, human health, I aimed for conducting research on impacts of SRM on malaria dynamics in Global South. So if we talk about human health, so regarding human health, the malaria particularly is an endemic in Global South. So the impacts of, I've been conducting my research on SRM, impacts of SRM on with a special focus on malaria dynamics across South Asia, with a particular focus on Pakistan. So I'm gonna share some initial results about the potential benefits and risks of SRM, and with respect to the stratospheric aerosol injection. So a little more about SAI, which is like stratospheric aerosol injection, which comes under the umbrella of SRM. So it has, you know, it has come into the imaginations of people because of the Mount Pinatubo eruption that happened in 1991. And the idea of injecting aerosols into the atmosphere is basically, you know, we are gonna artificially injecting the aerosols in the atmosphere, stratospheric layer of atmosphere. So the eruption event was observed, and scientists basically observed stratospheric SO2 particles in the atmosphere, which actually maintained the temperature overall like around the globe. So this is the but it is crucial if we, you know, carry forward our conversation based on some scientific analysis. So this is the time series on the left side half, right half of the slide actually, and which shows the the CSM2 is a model, CSM2 combined with Wacom-6 under the scenario of SSP245. So this is the baseline scenario, which is basically indicating the temperature, normal gradual increase of temperature, which is our normal temperature. And it is indicating that by the 2069, we will be approaching the temperature of 2.5 actually. So, and the other four and 5 scenarios are indicating the different targets that we have simulated, the models have been simulated. And the SAI 1.5 target has been proposed by the Paris Agreement. And that is obvious that we're gonna target 1.5, and we're gonna keep that in mind. But if we see the temperature of if we inject the aerosol injection in 2035 for targeting 1.5, so it is gonna maintain the temperature down to 1.5. And the other 2 scenarios are the two integrated parts of 1.5. If we target 1 degree target, if we go for 1 degree Celsius, it is also going to maintain the temperature down to 1 degree. And if we are gonna approach 0.5 target, it is going to maintain down to 0.5. And there's this another scenario which is indicating SAI 1.5 in 2045, which means that what happens if we introduce the injection in 2045 rather than in 2035. So what's going to happen? So more or less, the 2035 scenario and the 2045 scenario are getting along with each other. So the climate change is getting bigger and more serious, and the situations around the world are alarming. So why does Global South need to actively participate in the SRM conversation? Because the Global South is the most affected part of the world by the climate change, and Global South is the part of the world who contribute the least to the climate change. So I'm gonna share the methodology through which I've been conducting my research. The data that I have used is ARISE SAI data. ARISE SAI stands for Assessing Responses and Impacts of Solar Climate Intervention on the Earth System with Aerosol Injection, that is abbreviated as ARISE SAI. So it has been, the data has been downloaded from Globus into the VACTRI. What is VACTRI? VACTRI is a mathematical dynamic model to estimate the daily insects bites with regards to simulating the relationship between rainfall and active period of malaria. So the active, daily insect bites that we use as like as a technical, if we say technical word, so it is known as EIR, entomological inoculation rate. What is it? It is defined as the infected mosquito bites per person per day. So if the EIR is greater than 0.01, it corresponds to endemic. Like it shouldn't go above 0.01. So what is further, the data is downloaded in VACTRI. The VACTRI takes two major variables that are highly influenced by like malaria. The dynamics of malaria is highly influenced by the two major variables, which are temperature and population. So VACTRI gives off outputs in 13 different variables, but we take only 3 variables, the outputs of 3 variables: temperature, precipitation, and population, which is EIR basically. So then we go through we go to the next step, which is SRM based malaria redistribution maps for South Asia. So the maps that I'm going to show you have been plotted on QGIS, which is the last part of our analysis, statistical analysis. Along with we plot the special maps, which are QGIS based display. So here are the ensembles of the variables that I have been working on. On the left side of the slide, the map is showing the baseline of the time period of 2015 to 2069. And the population, if the circled area of the population is showing the EIR, which is quite increased, and it is the region of South India. And on the right side of the slide, if we see ARISE 1.5, if we go after ARISE 1.5 directly, and if we inject the injection in 2035 to 2069, what we're gonna have? It is gonna redistribute and increase the malaria transmission. Like from 2035, after injecting or introducing the injection to the atmosphere, till to 2069. But in the two more scenarios, if we see the comparison of baseline and comparatively 0.5 and 1.0, they are showing the results. Like somehow the malaria dynamics has been reduced down to reasonable level according to the 1.5. So these are some special maps which are showing the malaria redistribution in the next decade. So my initial thoughts were actually pretty normal, I guess, because in the beginning of my research on SRM, it seemed a foreign concept to me. But as I was curious to know more about it, and when I digged further into it, so my perspective shifted to know more about SRM and not just leave it behind. So when I joined the conversation, and because it's a risk paradigm, and the risk paradigm has been introduced by the degrees initiatives basically, and it is pretty much valid to think that the world is already threatened by the climate change. And what will happen if we don't make the conversation inclusive at all? Do we have enough scientific evidences to reject the idea completely, or do we? And the same question goes for accepting and deploying the idea with knowledge. So we can keep the things in mind and just start getting involved and getting engaged with the conversation. So according to IPCC, those who contribute the least to climate change are often the most vulnerable to its impacts. And I've definitely urged the whole global south and its people that please get more engaged with the conversation of SRM, or whatever the option you think are good for mitigation. We should keep all the options on the table and think and see what are the consequences and what are the potential benefits of all the options. Like, there are always two sides of everything. So with that, it leads me to conclude my talk here. So it will be, I guess, fair enough if the most vulnerable countries contribute to the global scientific research based conversation, because why not? Involvement doesn't mean support. It only means that we are gonna see and look more into all the positive and negative aspects of one idea, which has been seen as a controversial idea and critical idea. But again, do we have enough evidences to reject it, or do we have enough evidences to accept it? So the scientists wants people around the globe to come forward and discuss SRM with scientific based analysis and make the conversation inclusive. So we need to be more proactive and less reactive in this case. And thank you so much for your time and attention. You guys are very welcome to ask questions.
Thank you, Varisha, for your talk and sharing your research. We definitely agree that we need to be more proactive rather than being reactive when we are discussing about SRM. So moving on to our next panel, our next panelist, Trisha, we would be sharing a recorded video of hers. She is not able to join us live because she's flying to the UK for her SRM research. She's also a research associate for the Degrees Initiative project and exploring the impacts of solar radiation modification on human health and biodiversity. In tandem, she is a climate change fellow with the Existential Risk Alliance. Her research investigates the interplay between SRM and global catastrophic risk. Trisha has published on SRM in South Africa, the geopolitics of SRM, and public perceptions of climate change. Her focus areas aside from SRM include climate extremes and existential risk. And in her free time, Trisha draws abstract art and is an avid reader of sci-fi novels. So she holds a Master of Science in Climate Change and Sustainable Development. We would play the recorded video of Trisha, and yeah, she would cover the health impacts of climate change and the impacts that it might have on precipitation, and particularly focusing on the global south. So let's hear from her.
Hello everybody and happy Climate Week. My name is Trisha, and albeit virtually, it is an absolute pleasure to share with you the work I've done in SRM over the past 3 years. So let's dive straight into it. At present, I'm working on a project investigating the risks to biodiversity and human health from SRM. The research is done with the Degrees Initiative, an NGO dedicated to putting the Global South at the center of the SRM conversation. For a bit of background about the project, I'll explain the current state of research. And at present, most climate model simulation studies have focused on the potential for SRM to ameliorate changes in physical climate variables, primarily temperature and precipitation, but limited studies have explored its potential to reduce adverse impacts on people and biodiversity, that is, to reduce risks. And this knowledge gap is particularly worrisome because environmental protection and health are central to human welfare, and both are key topics in the climate policy agenda. Therefore, understanding SRM's potential to reduce or increase risks to people and biodiversity is crucial, especially in developing countries at the forefront of climate impacts. That being said, the project has two focus areas, the first being biodiversity, which is being done by investigating the risks and benefits of SRM through stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, for over 30,000 species globally under 3 SAI deployment scenarios. And the second part of the project focuses on the SAI impacts on human health, specifically on the transmission dynamics of dengue, Zika virus, and Rift Valley fever virus. Lastly, this research will support SRM policy decisions in developing country contexts. And another project I've worked on over the last 2.5 months was done with the Existential Risk Alliance, or ERA, at Cambridge University. ERA aims to research how to mitigate existential risks or global catastrophic risks, which are events that could permanently and drastically curtail humanity's long-term potential, for example, through human extinction. And climate change is a focus area within the X-risk field, and more specifically SRM. And my project investigated the interplay between X-risk and SRM. So one could ask, how does SRM become relevant in X-risk? And the answer is termination shock, simply defined as a rapid and substantial rise in global temperatures following a cessation of SAI deployment. Following termination, there would be a buffer period of a minimum of several months, during which, if SAI is not redeployed, the impacts of termination shock would be felt. So if SAI were to be abruptly terminated, it's likely that atmospheric and oceanic carbon dioxide emissions would accumulate, and temperature rise would happen at a rate such that temperatures would rebound to what they would have reached had geoengineering not been deployed. And this abrupt spike in temperature would cause massive ecological damage, making adaptation almost impossible for life on Earth. It is often presented as one of the most severe risks associated with solar geoengineering, as its impacts would be catastrophic. So across the literature, two primary drivers of termination shock have been identified. The first, over on the left, is political instability, international conflict, and the collapse of a governing coalition. And the second driver, over on the right, is the occurrence of a global catastrophe that could either directly destroy SRM infrastructure and prevent redeployment within the buffer period, and secondly, the cascading impacts of the event could inhibit the political and/or economic capacity to maintain the SRM program. And although drivers of termination shock have been identified, SRM resilience measures to catastrophic events are lacking. That being said, and given that the effects of termination shock would be catastrophic, within the context of an SRM scenario, the study overall aimed to investigate if plausible pathways to termination shock from global catastrophic events exist and what these are. This was done to identify potential areas where mitigation measures could be established to firstly increase the resilience of SRM infrastructure to global catastrophic events, and secondly, to decrease the risk of termination shock from occurring. And this was done through a qualitative investigation of the pathways from 3 catastrophic events that could disrupt an SRM program for long enough to cause termination shock. The first is a solar superstorm, the second a volcanic eruption, and the third a global pandemic. And these 3 events were chosen because the nature of their interactions with SRM infrastructure are all quite different. And lastly, the study also contributes to existential risk literature with respect to double catastrophes. So briefly onto the methodology. The first 2 steps were to acquire the data, firstly through a literature review of SRM and termination shock with a focus on SRM infrastructure, and this includes deployment technology types, costing analyses, as well as SRM supply chains. And the other focus was to identify the primary physical and socio-political drivers of termination shock. And the second step was expert elicitation with a total of 11 experts in both the SRM and global catastrophic risk fields. The aim of the interviews was to develop causal loop diagrams to identify and understand the mechanisms and pathways along which risks cascade following the occurrence of each catastrophe to termination shock. And finally, I analyzed the qualitative data to identify key points of vulnerability and effective places to implement technological and/or political mitigation and resilience measures. I've compiled in total 3 causal loop diagrams based on individual interviews during the elicitation process, that being 1 mega diagram for each catastrophic event. And each interviewee was asked to identify if plausible pathways to termination shock following the catastrophic event exist against the backdrop of a future SRM deployment scenario. However, since the mega diagrams are very large and complex to present in the time I have left today, I'll present an example of a couple of interesting identified pathways to termination shock. The figure shown here illustrates pathways from a global pandemic to termination shock, and from the interviews, a commonly identified first-order impact in this scenario is that politicians and governments could blame the pandemic on the SRM program, and this is referred to as the blame game. And this could in turn deepen existing rivalries and erode the minimal existing global cooperation. The blame game could also lay ground for regional war that could escalate into a large-scale war, and this could increase the possibility of SRM infrastructure. This includes SRM fleets and air bases of being collateral damage of the war, which could both stop SRM deployment as well as prevent it from restarting, causing termination shock. And another plausible pathway from regional war outbreak to termination shock is that as nations engage in warfare, people who are anti-SRM could intentionally destroy SRM infrastructure as they would now have access to weapons. So far from engaging with the qualitative data, I have identified the following common key points of vulnerability to catastrophic events, that being disruptions to global trade and supply chains, the blame game, economic strain from the catastrophic event, and finally, exacerbated geopolitical tensions, the risk of conflict, as well as conflict itself. And now that I've shared a bit about my current and latest research, I'd like to briefly tell you how I was introduced to the field. One could say that happened at the beginning of my master's degree in 2020. During the first week, researchers in the department presented their focus areas to my class, and the researcher who actually came to be my thesis supervisor, Dr. Romerick Odulami, spoke about SRM, and I was instantly absorbed by the innovative and cutting-edge nature of the field. That same day, I went home, read up about the topic, and approached him the very next day, insisting that he supervise me, and so my journey began. And that brings me to my thesis, which investigated the potential impacts of SAI on temperature and precipitation extremes in South Africa. At that point in time, all SRM research in Africa focused on its climatic impacts at a regional level with one local scale case study. That being said, country and local scale SRM research was limited, and my thesis was novel in that it was conducted at the country scale. So using climate model simulations and 3 SRM deployment scenarios that projected rainfall and temperature extremes over South Africa, the study compared future climatic conditions both with and without SRM, and the results provided insights into the implications of a geoengineering world versus a world without geoengineering for water stress, agriculture, urban centers, and vulnerable communities in South Africa. The figure shown here illustrates the spatial distribution for the projected changes in temperature extremes, shown on the far left in column 1, the changes without SRM in column 2, and with SRM in column 3. The results reveal that SRM would cause a nationwide cooling impact, and an example of the implications of the cooling effect is that the projected decrease in the monthly maximum temperature, shown in the second row, under SRM could reduce heat stress, which could simultaneously mitigate infrastructure and human health deterioration. And lastly, with respect to precipitation, SRM could cause dry conditions across most of the country, except along the eastern coastline, where precipitation extremes could increase under SRM. And worth noting in the top row is the projected increase in consecutive dry days under SRM, which could have agricultural benefits, including increased crop yields and decreased livestock vulnerability. Finally, moving forward, I would like to further explore the interplay between SRM and global catastrophic risk, as well as between SRM and climate extremes. So please do not hesitate to contact me with any questions or thoughts about SRM, even if you'd just like to have a chat. Thank you all for your attention today. I do hope that this presentation was insightful.
Yes, so thanks to Trisha for sharing her research, and it's great to know as we focus on governance, she focuses on termination shock, and governance goes hand in hand when we talk about SRM discussions. So our first panel is towards the end. We have our last panelist, Holly. Holly Scobble is a research student at Queensland University of Technology based in Brisbane, Australia. And she has been involved in solar radiation modification research projects since March 2023, when she commenced her master's degree at QUT, which is a research partner within the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program. Holly, our last panelist, would be talking about marine cloud brightening, which is also another widely discussed technology of solar radiation modification, as Thalma has also mentioned, and she has been involved in the only field project that is happening in Australia in the Great Barrier Reef, and she would be sharing a little bit about her work over there. Over to you, Holly.
Thank you, and good morning, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on this panel, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. It would have been lovely to be there in NYC. Like it's been mentioned, my name is Holly Scoble, and I'm a research student at Queensland University of Technology based in Brisbane, Australia, and I've been involved in solar radiation management, or SRM, research since March of this year when I started my master's degree at QUT. Which is a research partner within the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program. My background is in environmental science, particularly aerosols and air quality also. And my focus within the research program is applying marine cloud brightening and fogging technologies to targeted areas within the Great Barrier Reef as a way to prevent coral bleaching. As part of the panel, I'd like to quickly talk about my involvement in SRM research to date. But before I go any further, I'd like to quickly take a second to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm coming to you from, which are the Turrbal and Yagara people of Meanjin, Brisbane. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the sea country on where we have permission to perform our experiments, who are the Gurungurrin, Gurang, Bailai and Turrbal Bunda people. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to mention that it's particularly important to ARAP that we have strong relations with the traditional owners during the experiments on sea country, and we have traditional owner collaboration during all the research that we do. But how did I get involved? My involvement in SRM began when I commenced a research degree in early 2023, and that's something I'd always wanted to do. This particular research program was advertised to me as working with marine aerosols over the Great Barrier Reef, led by a supervisor who had already known, Dr. Zoran Rostovsky, but I wasn't actually sure what the research entailed. The Great Barrier Reef, I am a North Queenslander, so the Great Barrier Reef has always held a special place in my heart. And not only is a natural beauty, but it has great ecological importance. It makes up about 10% of the world's coral reef ecosystem, and it's vital for ocean biodiversity. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park itself is the 7th largest protected marine park area globally, and that's approximately about half the size of Texas. But before I joined the program, I had very little knowledge about SRM and its applications on the reef, so it was kind of only by chance that I became involved in SRM research. But what SRM technologies is RAP investigating? RAP is looking into MCB standing for Marine Cloud Brightening, and that's a concept that's first introduced in the 90s as a potential mitigation against greenhouse gas-related climate change. MCB involves using aerosols, in this case atomized seawater or sea salt aerosols, to increase the albedo or the reflectivity of clouds over the ocean. These brightened clouds reflect a high proportion of solar radiation away from the Earth's atmosphere and provide a cooling effect to the surface. The photo here attached to the slide is taken from a drone of the fogging plume coming from the back of the spray vessel over One Tree Island Reef. And you can see the second vessel behind it about to transect the plume to measure aerosol properties. And this was part of one of the experiments that we undertook earlier this year. And we can't actually see because it's not in the frame of the photo, but there's probably a smaller boat, a tender or a dinghy within the lagoon of the reef, collecting more measurements over the reef itself. Our program has also looked into using sea fog, which is created by atomized water also. However, rather being uplifted into the cloud, this fog just sits just above the surface of the ocean and provides shade and cooling for coral experiencing thermal stress. The use of SRM within RAP is only focused solely on very small areas of the Great Barrier Reef in an effort to reduce solar radiation and provide shade to coral reefs at high risk of bleaching events. We've recently had the first bleaching event happen in a La Nina year in the summer of 2022, so it's quite timely that we've been testing this as we expect these bleaching events might get more frequent. The appeal of the MCB and fogging is that their effects can be targeted to a local area, and the activity can be seized quickly if need be. and SRM technologies within our app are being developed in tandem with a whole host of other reef adaptation technologies, such as coral transplantation and eradication of pest species such as the crown of thorn starfish. There's no desire to use SRM globally for large-scale climate cooling at this stage. My first exposure for SRM in practice was on the research trip where we undertook the test. And it was then I began to understand the scale of the project I was involved in. In March 2023, the third and largest to date on water field test of MCB and fogging technologies happened in Australia near the reefs off Heron Island, which is off the coast of a town called Gladstone in the southern Great Barrier Reef. The field test consisted of 4 weeks at sea and near daily testing of MCB and fogging turbines, and also in-depth data collection and high-level analysis. I was very fortunate to be a part of this trip, and it's a very beautiful part of the world to be doing research in, so very lucky to be involved in that. And this is also where I met our host, Clara, who had been invited along as an observer to the field test. So it was a great way to introduce new friends. The picture attached shows 2 MCB turbines, which are used to spray sea salt aerosol from seawater into the atmosphere where there's uplift into the clouds. A bit more about the research program. Obviously, my contribution to the program has been relatively new, and it's only made possible by years of experience and research from many teams of many people. The research effort to date has involved research and development of the MCB and fogging machines, nozzles, and nozzles via collaboration with several international groups. We've also looked into modelling of aerosol behaviour inside nozzles, as well as modelling of ocean atmosphere interaction and the modelling of coral mortality rates during bleaching events with this mitigation applied. The lab testing in coral species to determine suitability for shading. We've also done land testing of the spray machines and now sea testing of the spray machines. And we've done a whole host of sampling via all sorts of instruments, via boat, via plane, via drone, and also island-based labs. We've done a huge amount of data analysis, and we've also looked into researching energy efficiency and solving potential logistical challenges of upscale and deployment. My role within the program is to undertake and analyse measurements of the aerosol being generated from the fogging or MCB experiments in order to better understand the behaviour of the plume and the effects it will have on the reef and the atmosphere. The target solar radiation shading reduction is what we're looking for here. What is the future of SRM in Australia? I think it will only continue to grow. To my knowledge, our app is the only SRM-related program happening in Australia at the moment, but our program spans many cities, and while the fieldwork is based in Australia, we collaborate with research institutions internationally. The future of our app 2.0 involves further development of the technology to scale up to deployment on a commercial scale for the purposes of reef protection. And while the concept is based in Australia, the potential deployment could potentially be used on coral reefs all over the world with strong governance in mind. However, to get to this stage, we need trying to answer the energy efficient questions, such as attempting to generate high spray efficiencies and working with clean energy alternatives. Like I said, there's a huge amount of data that's been captured from this project, and first publications from the program are expected later this year. All SRM-related field tests performed within our app operate within the bounds of joint governance from several parties and consider policy and legislation from both federal and state bodies, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, traditional owners, and community stakeholders. There's currently limited national and international governance guiding SRM research, but based on our being here today discussing SRM governance, this is clearly changing. It's essential that strong and robust governance be provided as a framework for the future of SRM applications and research. And it's important we stay involved in the next steps. It's exciting to see what will happen next in this. Thank you everyone for listening, and thank you again for the host for allowing me the opportunity to be on this panel. I'd be happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Holly, for sharing your work with us. We're a little bit behind time, so we would be taking a couple of questions. So one question that I would like to ask for the panel is that given the ethical concerns surrounding solar radiation modification, how we can approach the ethical and moral aspects of your research and what steps are taken to ensure responsible practices. If any of you would like to answer. We're thinking we talk about ethical considerations while talking about solar radiation modification, right? And the work that you have been doing, how we're confirming that the moral aspects of your research are being ensured and it's being done with responsible practices. Did we get the question or? Okay.
Yeah, I'm
Great.
happy to jump in there. I think it's definitely important that we take into consideration the people that these interventions might impact. I think quite often, especially in the sort of climate modeling community, who perhaps look more on like a global scale, it's difficult to try and marry the two together and really think about what these impacts or what these interventions or how they might impact people on the ground when you're sat in front of a computer looking at global means and 20-year averages rather than specific events. So I think when moving forward with research, especially if there does become a time where we have to start thinking about or more field studies, I think taking into consideration where and with who those field studies would be impacting, it needs to be carefully considered.
Barisha or Holly, do you want to add up to that? That the research that you're doing, how you're maintaining the ethical considerations, or yes, or I also have yes. Go on.
Oh, sorry. I'd like to just jump in and say that I guess within the structure of the program, there's inbuilt considerations to ensure that the research is performed to ethical and moral standards. We have a whole team of people, not just doing the research, but doing the social impact assessments and the recommending environmental impact assessments. So I think having the structure of the program that we do kind of helps the foresight of the research that we do. There's many eyes on what we're doing.
Great. So
okay, so with regards to my research work, because I have a health background, so I'm particularly focused on human health, and it includes all the aspects of human health. So definitely, as we see, and because I have a background of biotechnology as well, so more or less I know that the climate change and the UV raises actually mess up with your DNA genetic makeup. So climate change can be very you can say cruel to the human health, but at the same time we see the concept of SRM being taken as a controversial topic, which is actually a controversial topic, but again we cannot give our final words about an idea without making the scientific research work very inclusive. And as ma'am Thelma, and the video that you have showed in the beginning of the panel. It was pretty much all about my presentation particularly, because you guys mentioned in the video that we have to make the conversation inclusive and scientific research inclusive as well. Because if we don't know the positive impacts and all the negative, we can also negate the idea, but it should be based on scientific evidences and not merely based on just what we think, how we feel about it. It's not about that. It's about the factual, you can say, representation of SRM. So the models that have been simulated, that have been provided by the scientists, provide pretty much all the knowledge that you need. It's just about how much you are curious to learn and look more into those models and keep perpetuating on the research that you want, as we have been conducting our research in regards of human health. So we have only focused on malaria, but there are other seasonal diseases which have been increasing in global south. And if we see in the northern areas of Pakistan, the northern areas in Pakistan were used to be very colder regions, but now they are also getting warmer, and those major two variables through which the seasonal diseases, basically the vectors of seasonal diseases which reproduce and transmit the disease person to person, get highly influenced by temperature and precipitation. So these are the when the temperature is getting warmer in the colder regions, the overall temperature, or you can say the overall conditions, are becoming suitable for the vectors and the the vectors for reproduce and transmit person to person. So it is increasing within time. As much as the temperature is increasing, the diseases are also increasing here. So there are also many hidden aspects that we don't know with respect to SRM, with respect to climate change. So yes, my only take on this is that, yes, we need to make the conversation and scientific evidences make inclusive, because without knowing anything, we cannot negate any idea. That's all. That's all from my side.
Thank you, Varisha. I would pass it to Thelma Krug. I think she has a question.
Not a question. I would like to contribute to this discussion, if I may. Obviously, in my thinking, this, the ethical issues that have been raised here is one more element that signals the need for us to have governance, and in particular, I would say international governance, I would say. And why is that? Because it's just through this that we would have been agreeing on certain principles to guide the development, the deployment of the different options on the SRM. Some might be less problematic than others. But why? One question that could arise is, has this been discussed, at the level of, for instance, the climate convention? And I would say it didn't get there yet. And why not? Obviously, there is a fear in my vision of the developing countries that when you start discussing options or technologies to minimize the risks, it is like you're agreeing that you're gonna go above and well above, the Paris Agreement's long-term goals. And when you're gonna have much more risks and much more impact in different parts of the world. And so it's the issue that we normally call the motor hazard, is that, we starting this discussion will deviate the attention from the huge mitigation effort, the rapid, ambitious, and sustained emission cuts that we need to have, to address climate change and put it in a no or limited overshoot, scenario. that IPCC has put forward in the last assessment. So I always say that obviously countries would be very much applying the precautionary principle, that despite the fact that you don't know much, it should not refrain, for instance, some initiatives that are against research. In my vision, this is very personal. This is not from the IPCC. The IPCC only acknowledges what the science says, that there is very little engagement of the global south. And if we look, who has been engaged in this, initiatives, mainly China, India, Brazil, has no one engaged in SRM, nothing, not in research, not even in thinking about it. Argentina has one person doing this, but it's normally, it's more money that does not allow really to come up to large scale research and filling in the research needs for a big project. So ethics is complicated in the sense that the fear that one has over SRM relates to the unilateral deployment as a result of the research being conducted in the global north and not so much in the global south, which would be the regions that could be very much affected by the large scale deployment. So unilateral decisions would make it very complicated and would undermine, the relation of addressing climate change from this collective angle and collective vision of working in the same direction and with the same line of thinking. So this is just, some of the thoughts that, ethics is another, label under governments that would need to be addressed.
Thank you, Thelma Krug, for your thoughts on that. On that note, we would need to end the first panel because we are already on behind time. And thank you everyone for joining us today in Zoom. It has been a pleasure to have you all. I wish that we could have taken this conversation much longer, but yes, would look forward to seeing you soon again in some other movement. Thank you very much. So for everyone here, we would have a QR code on the screen for word cloud. Okay, so we are gonna have a 15 minutes break for brunch, and then let us join again for our second panel, which is going to be in person. And let us join in 15 minutes. That would be 11:40.
Asma, could we shorten it to a 5-minute break just to stay on time with
Okay, so let's come back at 11:40. Yeah, 11:40.
Hello. Hi, if you are joining us virtually, we are coming back into the room and we will start up momentarily. Hello? Hello? Could I ask panelists to please come and sit at one of the tables if you're speaking in this next session? Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah. And I'll give the floor over to Clara.
We only have two, right? Great. And I'll keep one. Okay, hello again, everyone. So now I'm glad that we have attendance in person here. It's good to see you all. And I think maybe I will start by presenting our friends who are online, Ula and Prisha. Can you hear us well? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay,
We can hear you.
Great. Okay. So starting by Ula, he's 20 years old and he's a northern Sami who's studying microbiology at the University of Helsinki. He works for Operatio Artis, which is a youth organization whose goal is to promote discussion and ethical research on climate intervention techniques in Finland and abroad. So we're happy to be collaborating with Operatio Artis in this mission of raising awareness on SRM. Thanks, Ula, for being here.
Thank you so much. Excited for the discussion here.
Yes. Moving on to Prisha. She's 19 years old and she's from India. And she's the co-founder of ICPS, the Institute for Climate Policy Solutions, which is a youth-led global think tank, which aims to build and support innovative policy solutions to environmental challenges and promote capacity building of youth, particularly in the global south. Thank you, Prisha, for being here.
Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yes, and we miss you here in person with us, both of you.
Yes.
Now to our panelists here. Hello, Josh. Josh is from Ghana and he's the co-director of the new Youth Climate Justice Fund. Before he was the climate lead at the Office of the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. And he's also the founder of Green Africa Youth Organization, Gaio. Thanks for being here with us. Now, Loan, we've been collaborating together for the past year on the C2Gs project, looking into SRM. Loan has been involved with environmental affairs and international relations through his engineering study, so connecting both policy and engineering. He has professional experience working at the European Union delegation here in New York and the French mission to the UN in Geneva. And he has just started his master's degree in public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. So thanks for taking the time to be here with us. I know it's been hectic. Steph, she's involved in so many things that it's hard to like say her bio out loud, but she's here representing Youth for Nature, which is a youth-led organization, mostly looking into nature-based solutions and biodiversity and storytelling and so many amazing things that they're doing. Thanks for being here, Steph. And Irfan, he's the founder of Sustainability Week Pakistan. He has a joint master's degree in geography and environmental risk and human security from the United Nations University in Bonn, Germany. And he's also an international strategy fellow with Silver Lining, which is also an organization that's looking into SRM. So to kick off our panel, I think I'd like to hear from you guys. Why do you think we should be having these discussions as young people on SRM? And how do you think we can get more young people involved? Yeah, Steph.
Yeah, okay. I think first of all, as it was already mentioned by the previous panel, because we are going to be the ones long term dealing with the consequences and the possibilities and the challenges created by this type of technologies and the lack of governance or the governance of it. So, first of all, long term thinking, but also because it's important to bring young people into the discussion because we are experts in more than just being youth, right? We're experts in our areas, in science, in history, in geography. And for these technologies to move forward, we need new research as well. And it needs us, it needs this kind of broad spectrum and this new knowledge. I think what some of the panelists before were exemplifying, right? That they're young researchers in that area. And that also brings kind of a hunger for new knowledge and for experience and kind of a fresh perspective that we need. So it's kind of an ethical, but also a very practical issue of bringing new things to that discussion.
About your first part of the question, that why should we talk about SRM, our climate intervention topic? So, according to IPCC news synthesis report, which is clearly showing that we are on the way to exceed 1.5. So once we get there, so it's gonna be the tipping point for many systems. So then, is there we already having some option on the table if things get worse? So I think yes, then SRM or climate intervention could be an option that could be explored. It could help us reduce the devastating impact of when we exceed 1.5 degree. And now the second part of your question is why you should get involved. I think so definitely you should be part of it because we're gonna be the generation who will see the impact. So it's very important that we should have our voices as well in this topic when it gonna, especially on the research part of it, but also the governance part of it. So youth should be integral part of it. Why? Because we're gonna be there to face the devastation impact, but the most important, involving young people, young researchers can bring a lot of new ideas, innovation to the table. So which is why it's important to have them on the table as well. Thank you.
I think one thing we should underline is that there's a gap between the urgency to talk about SRM and the lack of awareness and the very few people that actually know about or have heard about SRM. And so to answer to the how and the why, I think we could have a common answer. It's all about framing these issues and showing and conveying this idea of urgency. First, to show that SRM could be seen as a potential solution to mitigate, to decrease global temperatures, but it could also be a threat. And that's this dual idea that we should keep in mind. A second thing that has been a bit less covered during the first panel is that it is actually somewhat financially accessible. Research has shown that it requires something like $20 billion a year to decrease on the long term by 1 degree global temperatures. So we could imagine that any country could actually implement that on its own. But the problem is that, and that's the third point, there is no legal framework today that is controlling how SRM is governed. And so all of these 3 points, in my mind, convey this idea of urgency and tells us why it is very important to talk about that. And how, I think in this panel and the one before, we really saw how interdisciplinary this topic actually is. It's not only about policy or engineering, it's also about health, agriculture, even geopolitical issues. Maybe we'll talk more about that. And everybody has a say in that.
Yeah, on my side, I think two things. One is equity and the other is justice. I think this is why young people need to be part of these conversations. From previous climate solutions that have existed, the only possibility for it to be implemented with a very fair and justice lens has been because young people were asking for it. So even the Paris Agreement and 1.5 degrees, it was 2015. And it was only in somewhere 2019, 2020 that 1.5 became such a global conversation because young people put it on the forward like that. And the reason why more spaces get open and inclusive decision making, all because young people are asking for it. And before we can get SRM and climate intervention at large to be at a scale where it's ready to either stop or proceed, whatever that is, I think the more we understand as young people, the better we can call for sort of justice and equity in the way it's done. So for me, it's really about getting young people to be aware and being able to advocate for these things that really matter to us, which is equitable implementation and integrating justice in every solution that exists.
I agree with all of your answers, so we're on the same track. Prisha and Ula, do you want to jump in?
Sure, I would like to add to the last point. I believe that it is really important that us young people are at the forefront of this discussion. But I'd like to add that it should be, in particular, it should be the most vulnerable communities, like Global South, indigenous peoples, and I guess the global working class also is the much more vulnerable than the wealthy. But this is why we have to be here and discuss this, because we must make sure that from the start it is led by the people who understand the necessity of it and the risks of it.
Yes, so young people should also be part of the conversation, and the importance of why we are having this conversation event today is that there is not much awareness about SRM, and because young people can play a very crucial role in generating awareness, in holding people accountable, in ensuring equitable and just governance models, and also in the long-term research and process of it. Because as we saw in the previous panel and here as well, that young people are also engaging, have expertise to look into the models to ensure and to contribute to the discussion meaningfully and ensure that it leads to a more accountable, a more evaluative and a representative framework we have.
Thank you so much. And I think this time I would just make use of the fact that you were the last one speaking, and I'll start with you. Most of us here touched on the point of the Global South and marginalized communities. Would you say there's such a thing as a colonialistic approach to SRM discussions or research? Ula is nodding. Do you want to start?
Sure. I think it's very likely that that SRM and climate interventions in general will might become just another form of colonialism, a new form of it, and because the long history of colonialism that most of us are probably very well aware of tells us that that progress or progress in general is often made with on the expense of the Global South and indigenous peoples, and we need to be very, very aware of that, and we need to make sure from the start that we're on a different path than the colonial path, because it is not a good path.
Thank you. Prisha, do you want to jump in or?
Yes. So when we're talking about SRM, it is inherently a global aspect, because it was going to impact every single living being on this planet, and also the abiotic processes and the ecosystem which is sustaining them. So that is why when we're talking about SRM, then the global governance and the geopolitics comes into play. And we can see that the colonial power dynamics which has existed is present even today, and that is something which could jeopardize the future of SRM, the representation, the accountability aspects of the governance model of SRM, because that is an area where every country, every region, and every key stakeholder, especially future generations, would need to be, it is essential to have an equal voice so that attention is being given on all aspects, and also the different thematic areas which is highlighted also in the previous panel, when we have different aspects like food, sustainable consumption and production, how it is going to impact agriculture. It impacts all the dynamics of the global geopolitics, as well as the different industries. So that is why it is essential to ensure transparency and the accountability aspects, because it is very likely that the present power dynamics, the inequalities will come into play even when we're having the conversation on SRM. And that is very dangerous, because that is something which can lead to an unfair, and that can basically not lead to improper and unjust research. And there are speculations about SRM being used in different forms, SRM being used in forms. So that is why it is important to ensure accountability and that everyone has an equal say.
Yeah, we hope so, that everyone has an equal say. And you touched on the geopolitical impacts, and Luan also did. Is there a scenario that really worries you when we're talking about SRM, that you think might be driving people away from the discussion? Steph was like, "Well, Luan, maybe you want to start because you were the one bringing that up."
Unfortunately, I think there's many worst case scenarios with SRM. Whether we're in a situation where we have no other choice but to deploy urgently SRM, and if there's no sufficient research, then it's not done in a well-informed way. Another bad scenario would be to use SRM as an excuse to continue business as usual. But regarding geopolitical aspects, we saw during the previous panel that deploying SRM could have impact on rainfall patterns or droughts, and it could be used in a way to control neighboring countries or adversaries countries' weather or access to water, and it could have direct implication on agriculture and crops and create more food insecurity and foster conflict. So in that way, it's a very delicate and tool, and that's why international debate is more than urgent today.
Yeah, I think he picked up everything. I think my biggest fear would be that of business as usual, and that we would just postpone action to just like, okay, there is this solution down the road that is going to fix everything, so let's continue. But to bring another aspect into the discussion is, for example, when we take into account this rise of the far right, right? For example, in Europe, that's where I've been based for the past more than a decade now. What if countries would just say, oh, let's use SRM to avoid migration as an excuse? Let's just use it in the countries, and we're like, okay, we're putting a patch on climate change, then these people have no excuses anymore to come here. And I think this kind of very dangerous and I don't know, aggressive rhetoric can be applied to a lot of things, and goes associated with the challenges that counterbalance the opportunities that these technologies bring to kind of give us more time and kind of figure it out, long-lasting solutions. But I think it would be that like also with migration and kind of limiting people's like, okay, you don't have to move anymore because of climate change, because it's not going to be an issue immediately for you now.
Yeah, totally agree with you both. And maybe just add on to yeah, the worst case is like the damage it's bring, when you deploy SRM. But then do we having a plan to do the damage control? And for that, it's really important to have some sort of international framework or protocol where everyone can follow with the clear activities, so things first we will try to kind of mitigate the worst scenario. But if things goes wrong, so who and how it's gonna be taken, who will take the responsibility, and who gonna step into to control the negative consequences, is also referring to what Joshua mentioned already, to have some sort of climate justice lens, inequity lens, to it, that everyone on the table, it should be on the table: young people, indigenous people, people from global north, those who are having the consequences of climate change, especially people from global north. So if all the people are on the table having their voices, so I think that it could be mitigate the worst case scenario which we are talking about.
Josh, before maybe you jump in, you touch on the point of responsibility, and you, Josh, you've worked within the UN system for a while now, and I think I'd like to hear from you. Do you think there's an actor that's most responsible to guide SRM discussions and really come up with a governance framework? Are you hopeful that we can get there, or not really? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, currently there's nothing like that. Can we get there? I think yes, we can get there. It's the question of how we're going to get there. We might be forced to get there when people and countries or companies start doing it. So we could get a bit ahead of the curve and have something in place. I think in general, we are looking at this from my perspective, and I'm playing a devil's advocate here, so to some extent. I think we're looking at it from a wrong perspective, because if we are being very true to ourselves, I mean, deep mitigation or the actual mitigation that we're asking for is not working, right? It's not like we are getting to a point where we see emissions going down and we're having the confidence that we need to keep doing that and invest a lot in that. So mitigation is in principle not working for the past years that we've been focusing on that. I come from a very bit of adaptation, resilience, and disaster background, so I'm a big fan of adaptation, instead of invest a lot in adaptation. But to some extent, the finance for adaptation is not flowing, and money likes to go to mitigation by default. So if I look at that and I project, the likelihood of money going towards SRM is pretty high to some extent, because people love mitigation. It's numbers, it's calculatable, they're going to do it. Right? They're not going to as much invest in adaptation and resilience as much as we're advocating for it. And that is the reality now. Hopefully it changes. I don't want that. I wish it will change. If it changes, great. If it doesn't change, this will be something that will get money. So the big question is not whether we see it as, oh, people are going to do this and they're going to stop, companies will keep polluting, or they will see this as a solution and not invest in deep mitigation again. That all those issues will still be happening, and this will fall on top of that. We shouldn't get that wrong. I don't think there's anyone saying that once we start doing SRM, it means that we give up on the climate. No, I think that is going to be, I think every panelist I've said, every researcher I've said, this is another tool in the toolbox. The bigger question I think we should be looking at is every country, every region having what it takes to be part of inclusive conversation about this. If you do not understand the issue, you cannot be part of the conversation as much. So it's just calling for inclusive, and having a convening and bringing people to the table. You have a very weird power balance. If the US is there and you have a country like, I don't know, Togo, and the US have universities with good amount of money doing research on this, and the other country have nothing, with no expertise, and even to some extent, I think I can confidently say that even within the UN and within the UNFCCC, the amount of knowledge and expertise and money dedicated to research like this is very little. So how can we have inclusive conversation if there is that imbalance in terms of where resources are? So I think a first line of action, how can we get the research table to be a bit more balanced, have different countries, different stakeholders have a good level of understanding, technology, the supercomputers, whatever, to do the modeling and be at the same level, to have good conversation at the same level. I think that is very important. And then once we are there, we can start talking about how do we want to proceed with research on this. And I think the moment I hear the worry, I think we cause a bit of fear and panic around research on SRM because we see it as very scary. But to be honest, a lot of the climate solutions have not done great, right? Offsetting didn't do well. Carbon credits is not doing well. There are big initiatives around carbon market. It doesn't deliver benefit to the everyday person. It's still corporates benefiting, it's still big public institution getting some money. So if you really want to get to the point where you really want to do the big changes around climate solutions and making it equitable, just, it's not about stopping research. I think it's rather invest more and more and more into research, get all your questions answered and make a decision. But everyone needs to be able to come on the table with a good level of knowledge and understanding to be able to contribute to that conversation. And currently it's not possible because some countries have already have the tools, have the research, have the money, and others don't even know what we're talking about. So that unfair balance, I think that should be the first course of action. How do we get different stakeholders having the tools and the resources to invest in this research? And if you look at the story shared by the previous panel, people went to universities and heard about this and they took studies in it. How many universities in the Global South have any course at all, around not even SRM, around even carbon removals? Very little. So how can we expect to have inclusive conversation when this doesn't even exist as an infrastructure?
Well, that sure is a problem. But I also think, how can we bring to the table those people who don't want to talk about research? Because we also need them to be part of the discussions. And I'm thinking here because Ulla comes from the Finnish Sami side, and we know that there was the Harvard experiment, Scopex, that was canceled in Sweden by the Sami Council. But you, Ulla, you want to talk about SRM, right? That was your opening speech. We should be having more discussion. So do you have any takes on how we can discuss climate altering technologies with those who don't want to be part of the discussion?
I think I think my view partly works with Joshua's speech just now. I think that we need some leverage or we need something to make sure that politically the whole SRM will not be used, for example, on the expense of Sami people or on the expense of Global South. So we need to make sure somehow politically we need to decide. For example, I have been thinking that we should decide that the last word should be the last word on any one technology should be with the people who are the most vulnerable. And if we decide on something concrete like that, then it would be much easier for everyone who is understandably skeptical of the technologies to come and work on them. Because as you said, most Sami people are against climate interventions, and it is because the chance of climate intervention or SRM being done right is very small, at least I think so. So it is, for some communities, it is much safer to dismiss the whole idea and work against the whole idea of climate interventions. But I believe that that climate intervention is something that must be researched, because the alternative is accepting so much damage and victims. But I understand that I understand why many people just give up on the topic. But I think we must, as I'm just repeating myself now. Yeah, maybe I'll give the.
Thank you, Ulla. No, but you were clear on that. Thank you. We unfortunately are running out of time. So as Josh already played the devil's advocate. Um, I'm actually thinking, what are the questions that we're not putting on the table? Do you think we're missing out on something that might be the key to bring more people to SRM discussions? Is it like what is the approach that we should be taking that we might not be taking as of now? Do you guys have any takes on this?
Based on my background, as a researcher, so I think so it's really important that we like aware people more as much as possible to have more, I would say, research on the topic to come clear with I would say with the clear insight, clear information to the table. So once there is a clarity on it, once there's some question which people have in mind and not are somehow jumping into the topic. So I think so for me, it's really, really important that we should do more research somehow to deep dive and explore the different scenarios. I would say the word scenario that that it can bring. So awareness, I think, was the important one. I see a lot of people, they are not having much, I would say, awareness on the topic that what actually it's mean, how it can be implemented on the ground, what are the negative consequences of it, but what are the positive side of it. So once we having clarity on this different aspect of it, I think that will be easy to bring people on the table. And this most important while doing the research, while exploring these whole different themes in scenarios, important to not having this unilateral approach. Multilateral approach, bringing people together, exploring it together, and the most important, people from the global south to bring it, because at the moment, once we see a lot of research been focusing on global north, and people in the global north are leading into it. And also, just Joshua mentioned, some people like in Africa and Asia, this topic is quite new to them, so they don't really know about the topic. So if we want to have their I would say engagement there in to have them on the table, it's really, really important to also engage them in this world journey from our first step till the end.
Yeah, I think adding to that and just framing it in a different way, I think it's really important, especially this youth movement coming up now and growing, the effort of capacity building and knowledge sharing with other youth across the globe to kind of enforce this equity. I think this is something that we at Youth for Nature, we focus a lot on, it's kind of like this knowledge distribution and how can we bring this to the local perspective of people, because then in the end, young people are going to be the agents of change, right? In their local communities, localizing this knowledge and kind of like putting it forward. And then it brings us another question that I would have, where how do we center nature into this discourse? So it needs to be people and nature centered as well, to make sure that is a more holistically approached as well. And lastly, and I think that's the bottom line of everything, systems change, right? As we said, we need to move away from this system that we currently have, that is what is hurting our planet, and it brings us to even bigger discussions that no one can get their heads around on. For example, degrowth, post growth, green growth, there's these kind of things. So it's really changing the parameters. I think this is a patch, it's a band-aid. It allows us to have a little bit more time to kind of gather ourselves around and see a common future forward, because otherwise we're walking together to doom, I feel like.
I think that one thing to keep in mind when we think about bringing more people to the table is that governance is not only about allowing SRM deployment. It's also about how to ban SRM if it's the decision taken. But to get there, as it's been said, there's a need for more knowledge on that, and it can be done by gathering people and sharing information. If in a specific country there's not enough resources to conduct research, and we've had example of great projects such as the Degrees Initiative, that is sharing resources to foster research in developing countries as well. Because once SRM is deployed in one country, it has repercussions and impacts in all over the globe. That's why it's very important that everybody has a say, not only countries, by the way, NGOs and indigenous people, young people as well.
On my side, a couple of things. I think the access to knowledge and expertise on this is very important. And I'm speaking from other climate solutions that were very seen as a good thing and later on became quite a problem. So if you look at carbon credits, how many the carbon accounting mechanisms are based in the global south, right? And how many expertise within the countries where the trees have been planted or the energy projects have been done have their own accounting mechanism. You always have to fly in consultants to do that, profile it. So you spend a lot of money, again, going to the global north. So for me, it's very important that the very basic thing at this stage is having the resource available within countries in the global south to understand what this is. Green Africa Youth Organization next year will develop programs in 5 countries, universities, allowing young people to access courses on this, which is very important. I know that Silver Lining is having an initiative supporting young people to attend events and conferences within the scientific community to understand more around SRM and what it means. I think these are very, very important to get people to first understand where is the conversation, how can I learn about it? And if I wanted to actively work on it from a science perspective, from advocacy perspective, these are my options. I think that is very, very important. Then the second thing, which I think we need to really reflect on a little bit, and I use COVID as an example for this. If you look at COVID and vaccine, right? It felt like we didn't have enough time to produce a vaccine that would be viable for us to use publicly. But the only way you could answer that question was to keep the researchers doing their research. So I think we might not at some point, and I think I like what you said, at some point we might not even go via this route at all. And SRM might be something that we completely discard. But should researchers stop researching now? No. Should they keep researching? Yes. Should we make sure that there's resources for that? Yes. Should we make sure that there's equitable resources across different parts of the world? Yes. Can we as a community advocate for that? I think that is what I think should happen. That young people should really think of themselves as, if this ever becomes something that become practical, right? Who are the expertise we will have on this? And will they be people from our countries, right? And if that is not the case, then as a young person, I'm interested to see people from my country taking courses in this, doing research on this. So that is what I think should happen. Yeah.
And on that note, I think you've all, Prisha, do you want to add something? Prisha and Ula?
Thanks, Clara. So also I was saying that, maybe because right now it is a lot of people are not interested in research because it is sort of paradoxical, because if in future there is a point where we have to implement SRM, then it basically means that the mitigation efforts and the efforts to reduce the global warming has not been successful. But then again, if with research it is possible that maybe in future with research, the unintended consequences and the negative disaster, other negative aspects like change in rainfall patterns and other negative impacts on industries, that can also be minimized even with more research in SRM. So SRM could be implemented without its unintended consequences, and I think this is something which also needs to be shared a lot more, so that people who are not interested in engaging on conversations on SRM, they are also aware that with research that is also something which is possible. And also this if such a framework of equitable and representative governance model and conversations on SRM are being held more often, then that will also lead to a future where people are more aware and open to such technologies and research in such fields like SRM.
Ula, do you have anything to add?
I think that the inequality of knowledge and that there's no resources and no universities in some parts of the world, it is a great problem. But I think that it can also be used as an excuse to not listen to those people and not engage them. Highly educated people might have the tendency to think that they know better than other people, and thus not even reach out to them. And I think it is. I think that even people who are not highly educated have great inputs, or may have great inputs on things such as SRM, because well, I can only speak for myself here, but at least as Sami know our lands, and we know how our nature works with the collective knowledge of countless generations because of oral tradition. So we have like this silent knowledge on our ecosystems, and thus we can understand and point out risks in technologies, even if we're not engineers ourselves. Of course, there are Sami who are engineers and scientists, but this I think this is also something that can be thought of in the global scale.
And I think that only shows that we have a lot of work to do globally on SRM. And I think on that note, I unfortunately have to close our panel. But we touched on so many different things that I think like lots of panels will come out of this one discussion that we had. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm really glad that we had this event to launch SRM Youth Watch, and I'm looking forward to our next steps and how we will solve all of those questions that we came up here with. I think we can't run away from them now, and yeah, we have to take responsibility for them as well. But I know we're all on board. So yeah, thank you guys, and also to Ula and Prisha.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great joining in.